So for our last speaker for tonight, we have their topic is From Catholic to Cocksucker, Letting Go of Shame. Like many American youth in the 90s, Alex's Catholic upbringing taught him that same-sex relationships were shameful. I understand that so much. His school showed him all too graphic images of people with untreated HIV/AIDS to keep him from having sex. Because he knew he was gay, Alex suppressed his sexuality. Convinced that sex would destroy him, Alex went down a path of shame and isolation that eventually turned to suicide. But for the past 6 years, Alex has worked on a sex education documentary, A Sexplanation. In it, he takes audiences on a playful, heartfelt journey from his shame-filled past to a happier, healthier future. Hear what he's learned by turning the camera on himself and how he's turned his personal pursuit of shame-free pleasure into a call for comprehensive sex education for everyone. So director Alex Liu's work explores taboo topics like sex and drugs in order to broaden our understanding of science, morality, and how to negotiate a meaningful life. He's developed two YouTube channels focused on sex and drug education, totaling over 5 million views. After studying molecular toxicology at UC Berkeley and science, health, and environmental reporting at New York University, he produced video, radio, and print content for Nova Science Now, CNN Health, and San Francisco NPR station KQED. Everybody, Alex Liu.
Hi, everyone. Excuse me.
Hello.
I have kind of golden brown skin. I have black hair that's shaved really tight to like a buzz cut. I have a little stubble because I haven't shaved in a little bit. And I'm wearing a t-shirt with kind of a Japanese wave pattern, blue and white t-shirt. Great. All right, it's great hearing from everyone. Thanks for the introduction. A little bit more about myself. I'm a Chinese American who grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I grew up Catholic, but I'm a steadfast atheist now. A big reason I am is because I came out as gay in 2001, and the church made me feel like that made me a really bad person. Now, if you've decided to come to these talks, you probably don't need me telling you how sexual shame is unhealthy. But it's one thing to know intellectually that sexual shame is bad for you. It's much more difficult to figure out how to actually get rid of that shame. And I'm not sure I have the answer, but I am a science and health reporter. So if I don't know the answer to a question, I make a documentary asking the smartest people I can find to help me think through a problem. And while shooting my latest documentary about sexual shame, I realized that I didn't really even know what sex is. Now, if I were to ask you to define sex, what would you say? Would you say it has to do with holes, fluids, and genitals? Intercourse? Orgasm? Do you need to be naked for sex? Do you even need to be in the same room as your partners? Is phone sex sex? What about sexting? It's certainly sexual, right? So then, what makes it sex? It took me over 2 decades to get an answer that starts to make sense. So 20 years ago was my last year of secondary school. It was the worst year of my life. I was suicidal, I was making plans to end my life because I just couldn't see how my sexual desires could ever make me happy. Because at 17, the only times I had heard any authority figure talk about men having sex with men, it had to do with shame, suffering, and sadness. On the news and in the classroom, I only heard about gay sex when it came to HIV/AIDS. Politicians and priests compared gay sex to sex with animals and children. Queer men were regularly ridiculed, beaten, and killed, and people did very little to stop them. And this terrified not just me, but also my classmates. I know this because when I finally found the courage to tell a friend I was in love with him, he told me he'd rather die alone than be in a relationship with a man. Luckily, I have some amazing parents who got me the therapy I needed. By my 20s, I was openly gay, marching in pride parades all around the country. I used to pray that I would turn straight, but now I wouldn't trade being queer for anything. But even though I have come out and I was still proud of my queer identity, I still had these really strong feelings of shame and anxiety when it came to actually having sex. Sex didn't feel like I thought it should. I often felt disconnected from my body. I didn't feel pleasure a lot of the time, and it left me feeling confused. And when I started finally finding the courage to talk about these feelings, it became really clear I wasn't alone. And it wasn't just my gay friends, it was all my friends. We all had these doubts and fears that we didn't know how to deal with. So I turned to my reporting instincts and just started digging into the scientific research. And because I was lucky enough to be living in San Francisco at the time, I had access to world-class sex researchers and educators who introduced me to a wide range of sexual cultures. I spoke with different kink communities and queer communities, polyamorous people who maintained sexual relationships with multiple people of multiple genders, asexual people who had no interest in intercourse, but still wanted romantic relationships. I saw there really were an infinite number of ways to be sexual. As long as there were consenting adults, there was no right way. Learning about all these different ways of being sexual started to release tons of shame. My definition of sex was starting to shift. If this research was helping me, I figured it might be able to help other people. So I started traveling the United States and Canada with a documentary film crew and trying to find the best sex researchers and educators and hearing how they defined sex. One of the most surprising interviews I did was with Father Donal Godfrey, a Catholic priest. I was there to confront him about the damage the Catholic Church did to me and my family, how much pain and anguish they caused when they told me that gay sex was sinful and I was going to hell. Upon hearing this, Father Godfrey apologized. He sat and listened. And then we had a conversation that changed how I see the world entirely. Many Christians don't understand Jesus as a sexual being, he told me, but he was human. I asked him to define what he meant by sexual being. Sexuality is what drives us out to other people. It's the spark, the energy. Everything we do is sexual. There's no part of us that isn't sexual. He went on. So you shouldn't be scared of sex and sexuality. It's part of who we are, an intrinsic part of who we are. Ultimately, my understanding of the church's message is to make us more human and more fully alive. If it doesn't do that, what good is it? So the conversation we were having was sexual? Yes, he said. Every encounter is sexual. I still have a hard time wrapping my head around that idea that every encounter is sexual. Because it would mean there's no way you can ever truly hide your sexuality, that in every interaction, there is a sexual dimension. It's thinking about sex not as intercourse, but more as pleasurable human connections of all kinds. A pat on the shoulder, telling someone they look good that day, listening to a loved one's fears, all interactions where we establish intimacy, no matter how small. Yes, intercourse is sex, but it's only one part of a playground we call sex. With this new definition of sex, I think much more about establishing strong human connections than I do about strong orgasms. I think more about the beauty of vulnerability than about the beauty of my body. I think about how lucky I am to have a brain built for such pleasures and how wonderful it is to share with others. My interview with Father Godfrey, along with many others, became my sex education documentary, A Sexplanation. In it, I devote a large portion of the film making an argument that if we want kids to stop being ashamed about sex, we need to be talking about sex with them as early as possible. But not talking to them about the scary parts of sex, but about the amazing parts of sex. Yes, they need to know about the biology, but what they really need to know is about the humanity. What if we told kids sex isn't as much about what parts you put in what holes, as much more about how we connect with each other as human beings, how we play with each other. That an intensely connected conversation, fully clothed and with no physical contact, might make you feel more intimate, more alive, more sexual than penetration. that the only thing that's normal about sex is that we're all different. And the desire to know people and be known, to see people and be seen, is what makes us sexual beings. And where's the shame in that? Now, at this point, you might be saying to yourself, well, it's well and good preventing sexual shame in children, but what about me? How do I get rid of my deep-seated sexual shame? If you're like me, you might always live with that shame. It's just a part of who you are. But maybe you can do what I do now when I feel sexual shame. I think about that expansive definition of sex. I think about how beautiful it is to want to connect with others in however way you want to connect. I think about how being sexual just means you're being fully human. So you have two choices. You can keep running away from something that's impossible to outrun. You can keep trying to hide from something that's impossible to hide. Or you can honor it. I think I'm ready, and I hope you are too. Thank you.
Wow, that is a really good talk, Alex. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yes, the world needs more people like you. So does anybody have any question for Alex? Feel free to type in your questions in the chat below, in the chat, or speak up. Because I really relate with your experience because I came from a Catholic school here in the Philippines, and they really shame you really hard. And I can really relate with your experiences too, especially that it took me how many years to accept that I'm probably not as bi as I think, nor was I lesbian, but more of a pansexual type of person. And I really think that sexuality and intimacy is a journey. Just
Yes.
because you think
always changing, always changing.
Always changing. Just when you think that you're like this, in the next few years, it's a whole different story.
Yeah, I think it's really about being open to connection, right? I think
yes.
I think identities and sexual orientations, they're useful and they're helpful in many ways in terms of finding community, finding dates, even just basic dates, right? But I think more and more that these kind of strict definitions are kind of imposing joints on a phenomenon that doesn't really exist. It's kind of an easy way humans like to generalize because it's just easier in many ways to get through life that way. And that's totally fine. But I think individually, personally, when you think about sex and sexuality, just know that you really don't have any limits other than the ones you put on yourself. And that your brain and body and spirit really is open to connections of many types. And the more we're open to that, just kind of the more sexual we can be and the less shame we'll probably have.
Okay. I'd like to ask in terms of creative person, or let's talk about film. Is there a difference between pandering and being authentically authentic in terms of representation on sexuality and then gender on sexuality really in the media right now?
I think completely. I think I've seen movies now that try to cram in gender issues, trans issues, and they don't feel organic to the character. They feel like they're proselytizing, they're trying to preach, they're trying to virtue signal. I think some of the best work I've seen that make a person's identity not central to their character, not central to the plot, not central to the movie, but just a one facet of who they are and develop them as an actual human, flawed, three-dimensional character. And I think to me, that is actual representation because I don't need a gay character to be a saint. I want a gay character to be a human. And the more we can kind of think in those terms, I think the better it will be for everyone to see how they themselves are queer or a woman or man, all these things that we think about in very strict binary senses that we contain multitudes. And that's what I think media can really do and help people see other parts of other people inside themselves.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alex. So now I'm going
Thank
to
you.
give the meeting over to Dr. Martha for our sex toy discussion. Okay, take it away, Martha.